Hello, my name is Catherine Hughes and this is the presentation part of my CT6CREFX module. Just before we get started, I feel like I should warn you that I do have a stammer, so if it goes quiet for a bit, don't worry, your internet hasn't gone out. I'm just trying to get my words out and I'll get there eventually. So for my CT6CREFX project, I decided to create a polar bear walking and have its skin jiggle and have some fur on that as well. I originally, as I said, planned to have fur, but due to time constraints, this was unfortunately not possible. I decided to do a polar bear because I thought that a polar bear would have the capabilities to be able to nicely demonstrate the possibilities of what both fur and a jiggle deformer could do. Since I'm not a strong modeler, I used a pre-made model, and while I'm appreciative of the struggles that I didn't have to go through to make this model because of that, I'm also aware that using a model that somebody else made does come with its fair share of snafus. Using an externally sourced model did save me an enormous amount of time, but on the other hand, some aspects of using it were of a real detriment to me. One such detriment that made itself very apparent during the rigging stage was the fact that this polar bear, while seemingly realistic and well made, was actually fairly anatomically incorrect. This meant that during the animation stage of this module, I did struggle a fair bit, as there was no way that the polar bear model would be able to be posed realistically without being stretched a lot and looking, quite frankly, ridiculous. While I was rigging this polar bear, I made the decision to rescind the bones and joints in the polar bear's tail. My reason being for this decision was that during my research I found out that at one point in time it's thought that polar bears had relatively long tails, but over time these have now evolved to stumps in place of them. And as a result of this, the polar bear's tail doesn't serve much purpose now, and they don't move of their own accord and instead just follow the movements of the polar bear's hips. Tagging on to this point, I also decided to not have a realistic amount of joints in the polar bear's spine. I decided on this as I thought that there would not be too much focus on the spine, in addition to there not being too much jiggle on that part of the polar bear anyway. Additionally, there would not be enough movement in the spine to warrant having as many joints there as a more realistic CG replica model would. Another alteration that I made to the model that differs from a more realistic polar bear is that I included additional joints in the forearms. I did this so that it would be easier to replicate the rotation of the paws when the polar bear would be walking, which would enable the movement to occur with as little unwanted deformation as possible. I locked the translation channels for these joints, so there was no chance that they could accidentally get manipulated. During the rigging process, I noted that the forelimbs and hind limbs are incredibly different in a polar bear. For one, the hind limbs only have hip, knee and ankle joints, with the heels laying flat on the ground. Conversely, the forelimbs have shoulder, elbow, wrist and heel joints which don't lay exactly on the ground, instead finding purchase slightly above ground, letting the first row of toe bones take most of the weight. I also made my own controllers so that I could spread the polar bear's toes for a more realistic standard of animation. I did this by first making two attributes, in and out, and assigning two toes to each of these attributes. The toes that are facing the outside of the polar bear, i.e. for the left foot, the last two toes would be assigned to the out attribute, while the two toes that are positioned more towards the centre of the polar bear would be assigned to the in attribute. I used IK joints for all four limbs, and this method was chosen for two main reasons. One being that it would allow for more realistic movement, and the other reason being that, if need be, the feet could keep their position while the rest of the model was in motion, providing a further sense of realism. Using the pole vector constraint was especially helpful in being able to position the asset in more realistic poses, as the knees and elbows could be controlled more precisely this way. One issue, despite copious amounts of research, that could not be overcome was the fact that the freeze transformations command couldn't be applied to any part of the rig. Every time this was attempted, the line of code that would appear is on screen now. Not being able to freeze the transformations meant that there was no easy way to get the polar bear back to its original base pose, which complicated things an incredible amount. For the first aspects of the CT6CREFX rig, I decided to do the jiggle first, as this would make it easier to see how much fur I should add and would enable me to tweak the fur more precisely. I did this by creating a jiggle deformer and adjusted the settings until I got what I considered to be a somewhat realistic effect. I first lowered the stiffness of the jiggle to 0.335 and increased the damping to 0.313 and increased the jiggle weight to 0.780. While it can be difficult to see the whole effect while the polar bear is in motion, it is wholly visible in its entirety at the end of the animation when all movements cease. Originally, I had set out to complete both the jiggle and the fur effects, but was unfortunately unable to succeed with one of these due to time constraints. When I attempted to create the fur using X-Gen interactive groom splines, the results that I got were patchy and only appeared on parts of the model. Despite my best efforts to correct this and adjust the settings, I unfortunately did not succeed. If I were to do this project again, I would definitely use a model that I have already created. I would do this so that I would know exactly what has been essentially put into the model, and there wouldn't be any surprises that way. It would also grant me with more time, as I wouldn't have to search for a model that suited my needs explicitly of the objectives for this module. I also would have chosen to only complete one effect and only go on to do another one if I was completely sure that the first effect would not be negatively affected by the addition of the second. I also would have spent more time on the animation for this module, as there's still a lot left to be desired on that front in particular. Additionally, I probably would have chosen to create a model that was something that most people could easily recognize, as this would directly lead to a more purposeful evaluation and critique of the effects. In this vein, I would probably choose to create an alien in place of a polar bear, as people don't know what an alien looks like in motion as well as they do a polar bear. Thank you for listening, and take care.